In chapter 4, we are going to start going through all of the essential nutrients, starting with carbohydrates, and then each chapter for the next little bit will concentrate on another one. So the student learning outcomes, again, this is just your study guide and to give you an idea of things you should be looking for as we go over the content. All right, so the first section, 4.1, we're just talking about why carbohydrates are the most important. So first of all, just refresher from earlier in the semester. So carbohydrates provide 4 kilocalories per gram, same as proteins, but they are a main energy source. So whenever we look at this, glycogen is one of the carbohydrates. It's made up of multiple glucose molecules that are attached together. It's highly branched. We'll see a picture here in a little bit. Just again, lots of those glucose molecules, but instead of being just in one long straight line, they go off in multiple directions. The purpose of glycogen is that it stores glucose in humans. So we'll talk about starch. It does the same thing. It stores glucose, but in plants. So because it's made in humans, of course, something needs to do that. So it gets made and stored in our liver and in our muscles. So muscles, as they're going through getting energy to make those muscles work, they have their own energy store in the form of glucose, storing that as glycogen. Of course, all the glucose ultimately comes from photosynthesis. So that process is just using energy from the sun to make compounds. And the main, not the only, but the main compound that it makes is that glucose. So that's the original source of glucose, and then it gets stored in our different plants or foods. Then we release it and store it as glycogen in animals. So some of the different forms of carbohydrates is what we will now focus on. So a couple concept maps here. First of all, talking about the simple carbohydrates, which are monosaccharides and disaccharides. So some of the monosaccharides, mainly again talking about glucose, but a couple other important ones, fructose and galactose, that we'll look at. So these are all simple sugars. Again, they're in the simplest form. They can combine to form disaccharides, which are 2 monosaccharides joined together, and 3 of the common ones we'll talk about. So table sugar or sucrose, which is made up of glucose and fructose, maltose, especially in alcoholic beverages. That's broken down from starch to give us 2 glucose molecules attached together. And then lactose, of course, in our milk is glucose in a monosaccharide called galactose. So our monosaccharides, the major one in the body, of course, is glucose. It can make table sugar by taking glucose and adding it to fructose. It's also called dextrose, in case you've heard that term. In the bloodstream, though, that sugar is referred to as blood glucose. So if we're talking about somebody's blood sugar, we're talking about the amount of glucose in their blood. And we get this from digesting or breaking down our starch and that table sugar or sucrose. And this is the main source of fuel for our cells. A couple other important monosaccharides. So fructose, again, glucose plus fructose gives us that disaccharide of sucrose, but this is essentially our fruit sugar. So that's what's going to be in fruit, but also honey. And then we hear a lot about foods that have high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS, which is just high fructose corn syrup. And that mainly comes from really processed foods, is where we're going to find a lot of that. So the presence of those means that it has been processed more so than if it just lists sucrose. Now, whenever any of these come in, they go to the liver, and there they're converted into glucose. Okay, so again, fructose comes into the liver from sugar or from honey or wherever, and it comes in and our liver converts it into glucose. And then if we have an excess amount of it, then it gets stored as fat. So even diets that don't have hardly any fat in them, you're still going to gain fat because that extra energy, whether it's from proteins or carbs, that gets stored as fat. All right, and then our last monosaccharide here, galactose, Again, it combines with glucose to make lactose, which is our milk sugar. Again, just like with the fructose in the liver, it gets converted into glucose. That's why glucose is the sugar of our blood, because the liver converts everything into glucose, because that's what our brain needs, that's what our cells need for energy. And then it's also, it gets made in the mammary glands whenever the glucose and galactose get made together. All right, now another simple carb are disaccharides. Again, this is just 2 monosaccharides joined together, still a simple sugar. 3 that we'll talk about here: sucrose. We already mentioned our table sugar is made of glucose and fructose. Again, mainly comes from all of our kind of sugary foods, of course, sugar cane or sugar beets, honey, maple syrups. Lactose in our milk products is galactose and glucose. Again, maltose is 2 glucose molecules joined together. Now, where we see this one is during fermentation. So whenever carbohydrates are converted to alcohol, or also acids and carbon dioxide. So our alcoholic beverages, this is why they have so many calories in them, is because maltose is found. So again, it's 2 glucose units. So as those are consumed, lots of glucose is released into our cells. All right, now switching to our complex carbohydrates, again, just a concept map here to kind of look at them. These are polysaccharides, just meaning there are many, many glucose or monosaccharides, anywhere between 10 to 1,000 or more. The 3 we'll focus on: starches, fibers, and glycogen. So glycogen, we already mentioned, that's how we store that glucose in our muscles and livers, muscle and liver. The starch is actually made up of 2 different polysaccharides: amylose, which is a straight chain, and then amylopectin, which is this branched chain of glucose. Then in fibers, we'll talk about soluble fiber and insoluble. So cellulose, it's in the plant cell walls, it's insoluble, we can't really break it down. And then we'll talk about pectins, especially in our fruits, which is a soluble source of fiber. So again, these complex carbohydrates, again, lots of monosaccharides. Again, starch, this stores that glucose in plants. So we have glycogen in animals and starch in plants. So again, glycogen is that storage form in humans. And then fiber is what cannot be digested. And again, we need this for bulk. It's important to our diet, even though we don't get nutrients or calories from it. All right, so starting with our starch. Again, starch has about 1,000 or more glucose, so it's really packed full of glucose, made up of amylose and amylopectin. Again, the differences we'd seen in our concept map. Amylose is just a long straight chain. It's about 20% of starch that we find in our vegetables or pastas. The majority of it, though, is that highly branched. It just takes up less space that way. And so that's about 80% is the starch that's in our food. So our root vegetables like potatoes, they have a lot of that amylopectin. So the question here is amylopectin a digestible form of carbohydrate? And yes, it is. We're still able to break it down to release energy and to release those glucose molecules. All right, again, just showing the difference here. Again, amylose, just that long chain of 1,000 or so glucose molecules. Amylopectin, also still glucose, but it's just more branched. So it's chains and then it cuts off and forms a branch. And the same thing with glycogen, lots of branch points, so that again, smaller space is needed to store that. All right, now looking a little bit at glycogen, again, highly branched polysaccharide, storage form in animals and humans. Again, it looks more similar to amylopectin because it's branched. And what also helps, besides just a smaller storage area, is it gives enzymes more places to break it down. So they're breaking all the little bonds that connect the glucose. So the more branch points, the more the enzymes can get in and break it down. And again, it's stored in the liver and our muscles. Now, fiber, again, indigestible polysaccharide. So again, our body cannot break the bonds, even if it's soluble. We can't break it down. But again, it's important because it helps add bulk and helps with digestion. So again, it's in either soluble, which just means it dissolves or is absorbed in water, and then insoluble fiber that does not dissolve. But either one of them, neither one can be digested. We can't break them down. We don't get any energy from them. Again, the importance though is that it provides that bulk. And then just a term here, dietary fiber. This is the term that we see on nutritional facts on the labels. And these are non-starch polysaccharides. Again, anything we can't digest is clumped into this dietary, whether it's soluble or insoluble. And this is, again, just kind of looking, pectin is an example of soluble fiber, which is mainly what consists of like the inner part of our apple, whereas the skin is the cellulose, which is an insoluble fiber. Also, if we look at bran, bran is made up of a germ that's surrounded by an endosperm. But again, these contain different insoluble fibers. Again, just kind of a nice little summary table here that kind of shows the same thing. So again, insoluble fibers, so there are carbohydrate and non-carbohydrate forms of that. Cellulose is kind of the one we mainly talk about. Both of them, though, increase that fecal bulk and helps decrease intestinal transit time. Transit time just helps it move through the body more regularly. So we find these in our wheat bran and our grains. Again, the fibers in all of our plants and our wheat products, different vegetables, and our fruit like the apple there that had the cellulose in the skin. Then the soluble fiber, there are only carbohydrate forms of that. So again, the pectin, different gums, that type of thing. So it delays the stomach emptying, so it kind of keeps food in there to allow digestion more time so that foods can be broken down and more nutrients can be absorbed. But it can also lower our blood cholesterol. So again, we find these mainly in our fruits, as well as in different brands and vegetables. Now, if we look at how fiber is listed on our food labels, again, dietary fiber, that's the naturally occurring, again, intact, non-digestible carbohydrate. So again, like the pectin and the cellulose. You may also see functional fiber. This is kind of isolated, non-digestible carbs, but these were added to the food to help with those physiological effects. So again, dietary fiber is the natural. Functional fiber has been added. It's not a food that typically has the fiber, so it's being added to it. All right, so now looking at some of these different concepts as far as where these come from and some different sweeteners. All right, so again, our food sources that have carbohydrates, of course we think about our grains, but we have carbohydrates in a lot of things. Actually, the majority of carbohydrates, kind of the richest sources, are empty calories, unfortunately. So sugar sweetened beverages that just have sugar in them. So again, a lot of calories and not a lot of nutrients from it. Those starchy vegetables and then fruits like bananas have a lot of sugar, a lot of carbohydrates in them. Some of our healthier alternatives, though, more of our grains and our wheats, even proteins are going to have, so we think about kidney beans and chickpeas, our vegetables, they also have carbohydrates in them. And of course, our dairy with lactose contains carbs as well. All right, so just kind of making some smart beverage choices. So keeping water with you, that's the best way to eliminate those empty calories. Limiting those sugar sweetened beverages. So again, sugar-free, sparkling, or mineral water. Again, just drinking water throughout the day keeps us hydrated. If you need a little flavor, using lemon or fruits to kind of flavor them instead of sweeteners. And then you can even download apps to help keep track of your water intake. Smoothies, again, there are good and bad, as with everything. Smoothies, again, we hear this is kind of becoming a new fad, but essentially know your smoothie. So knowing those ingredients. So Again, divide the homemade ones into kind of 2 servings and save one for later. Check the calorie count. Again, a lot of them have added sugars to them to make them taste a little bit better. But again, it's just adding to that added or extra sugar to your nutrition. So again, adding or asking for no sugar to be added to your smoothies if you're ordering them out. And then coffee is another place that it's easy to pick up some added sweetener and increase those empty calories. So opt for the low fat milk or soy milk to help decrease our carb intake. Again, smallest size to save on calories as well as money. Again, skip the cream and extra flavorings or use sugar-free syrups. And then limit the blended coffee drinks and select light versions that are available. All right, now if we look at our whole grains, so our dietary guidelines is to consume about half of all of our grains should be those whole grains. The majority of people, though, do not meet this recommendation. And as well as increasing the amount of whole grains, we want to limit the consumption of refined grains. So again, replace those with whole grains, limited refined grains. The reason we want to limit them is because they have a lot of solid fats in them, some added sugars, and that salt or sodium, all which are things we want to try to limit in our diet. So again, just look beyond the front label, look at the ingredients. And then an alternative to these, so white whole wheat has the same nutritional benefit, but has that milder taste. It's a little lighter, a little easier to pass off as white bread, but gives you some of those whole grains. All right, if we just kind of look at this table here, again, some ideas of what to look for, like pros and cons, or really pros are the whole grains and cons are the refined grains. Again, trying to increase whole grains, decrease refined. The refined only has that endosperm. So again, back to our little bran picture that we'd seen, the endosperm, just that little part. So that's all that's in the refined grain, whereas with whole grains, we have the whole thing. So we have the germ and we have the bran on the outside. So more of that complex carbohydrate that's in there. The reason we want to limit those refined grains is it increases the blood glucose, whereas the complex carbohydrates have a slower glucose because it takes longer to break them down. Refined are lower in fiber because they're missing out on the germ and the bran, whereas whole grains have higher fiber. A little lighter texture in the refined, again, are white bread, whereas a darker, denser texture that is seen with the whole grains. Typically refined, though, is less expensive because it's cheaper to produce, whereas the whole grains are typically more expensive. Again, lower nutrient density, but can be enriched or things added to it, whereas the whole grains have more vitamins and minerals and antioxidants that come from those extra parts, again, the bran and the germ. All right, just some of the things that you may see on those labels. So 100% whole grain. So for these products, all of the grain that's contained in that food has to be whole grain. So again, about 16 grams of whole grain per serving. 50% whole grain. So this means the products that are in that food have at least 50% of grain from whole grain. Again, kind of minimum, we want to have about 8 grams or so of that. And then our basic kind of stamp are food products that have a significant amount of whole grain, but less than half is actually whole grain. So again, minimum requirement about 8 grams per serving. So again, half of the full serving that we get with the whole grain. All right, so again, just kind of knowing your grains. This is just kind of more informational, not something I would ask as far as a test question, but just to make you more aware of all the different types of grains that are out there. So barley actually has the highest amount of fiber, so it also may lower cholesterol, even better than oat fiber. So think about oatmeal, that's really good for cholesterol. Barley actually comes out ahead of it. Buckwheat has lots of antioxidants in it, and it has this carbohydrate called rutin that improves circulation, but also prevents LDL cholesterol from blocking those blood vessels. Corn, of course, known for its sweet flavor, doesn't have gluten in it, helps with those antioxidants. But again, you want to avoid things that are degerminated on them. And then oats, again, thinking about oatmeal, so lots of protein here, common in our breakfast foods, but they're especially effective in lowering that cholesterol. But again, barley is actually a little bit better. Then a few others, quinoa, again, some different foods may have this. Again, it's a complete protein, has lots of different amino acids in it. Rice, so many whole grain varieties. Again, you have to watch. So again, this would be more brown rice, not white rice, same as our bread. But this is one of the most easily digested grains, so it's good if you need to restrict that gluten in there as well. And then rye and wheat, especially think about our breads, but rye actually promotes a rapid feeling of fullness, so it helps fill us longer on a smaller amount, so it's good at lowering that glycemic index we'll talk more about. And then wheat, again, look for the term whole wheat. So again, there's refined and there's whole wheat, but again, lots of gluten in there. It's very, which is a stretchy protein that allows it for that bread dough to raise. All right, looking at our vegetables as a source of carbon or carbohydrates, they, again, have a different source of starch, but also fiber. Again, thinking about the pectin in the apple or the cellulose in the cell wall. So the fiber in the vegetables may actually reduce the risk of heart disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. Also has a lot of vitamins and minerals in them, and typically low in fat and calories. But again, follow the MyPlate guidelines about selecting, and again, have a variety of them, not just the same one all the time. If we kind of go to our farm to fork here, focusing on potatoes in this chapter. So it's one of the most productive crops, harvested by hand, usually dry for a day and then enjoy them. As far as storing them in the refrigerator for a week, potatoes can actually be stored for many, many months, especially if it's in a cool environment. Whenever you're looking for them, russet potatoes actually have the most phytochemicals, and they provide a good source of potassium, vitamin C, and vitamin B. Also, buying organic potatoes help reduce that pesticide residue that can be on them as well. And as far as preparing them, keeping the skins on actually provide more nutrients with those vitamins and phytochemicals. Again, leftover cooked potatoes are actually better for controlling the glucose that's in there. And then again, decreasing the amount of fried types of potatoes like French fries and potato chips. Now looking at our fruits as far as providing carbohydrates, it's mainly in the form of sugar as well as that pectin or that fiber. So eating those as part of the healthy diet help decrease chronic disease. Again, using whole fruit is better or cut up better, so more so than using the fruit juices that typically have more added sugar to them, because not only does the juice have more sugar, but it decreases the fiber that's in them. And now our dairy, thinking about our carbohydrates, especially that lactose, again, providing that lactose. The content depends on the product, so not all milk products have the same amount of lactose. And then the dietary needs do differ depending on their age. So, switching to whole milk for the first year or so, and then introducing the low-fat milk as we age. So once that period is up, choosing no or non-fat options is a better alternative. Now, if we look at some of the different sweeteners that are out there, so again, these do provide calories. So they're artificial sweeteners we'll talk about, but the nutritive sweeteners, these do have calories. Again, most Americans consume about 20 teaspoons of added sugar per day, which exceeds the recommended 6 to 9, so more than double the amount. Again, the main culprit here being soft drinks or energy drinks that have a lot of these added sugars to them. our high fructose corn syrup, the HFCS, of course, as the name implies, it's made from corn. It's more abundant and inexpensive than using it from sugarcane or sugar beets. Enzymes convert that glucose into fructose. So it has about 55% of the fructose, which tastes sweeter than glucose. So you're getting more sweet taste. And again, ultimately, your liver transfers it into glucose. Another thing is it does increase the stability, so it helps last a little bit longer. And again, just kind of a tidbit here, about 24 pounds are consumed every year. So if we think about some different health outcomes related to these, so there's actually been shown, again, they get a lot of bad rap because it indicates they've been highly processed, but as far as research, there's no metabolic or endocrine difference between using the high fructose corn syrup or table sugar as far as sucrose related to obesity or other health outcomes. So some other types of sweeteners, there's brown sugar, raw sugar. Of course, honey can be used. A lot of low-fat, low-calorie diets replace sugar with honey, agave nectar, and maple syrup. So again, lots of different forms of sugar that are in the market to choose from. We also have sugar alcohols called sorbitol or xylitol. These have about 2.6 kilocalories, so again, less than most carbs at 4. But excessive consumption may have some laxative effects, so it increases feces release, and these do not promote that tooth decay. So again, our sugarless gum, again, is an alternative. That's where you'll see these. So in this example, sorbitol is used instead of sucrose. Now, some of the alternative sweeteners that are available, these have little or no calories whenever consumed. So the safety of these are determined by the FDA, and they indicate the acceptable daily intake for these. So again, the acceptable intake means there's not enough research to kind of put a specific percent on them, but there is enough to kind of help estimate the levels. So it's set at about 100 times less than the level to which they have harmful effects based on animal studies. So they are considered safe for children and adults, and even used during pregnancy. All right, so the alternative sweeteners, and there are quite a few of these out there. I'm going to kind of hit the highlights here. Aspartame is probably the most common, so NutraSweet or Equal, a lot of diet sodas contain this. Sweet and Low has saccharin, stevia or Truvia, and then sucralose and Splenda, kind of the main ones that we see. If we look at the sweetness intensity here, you can see the variety and the range of all of these, and then also the accepted intake. So some of them, again, not sufficient data to indicate, but you do see those for aspartame. So kind of some bad press or information out there about linking that to cancer. Again, this is controlled by the FDA, so things like that. Again, check your sources, ensure that it's coming from controlled studies. But at this point, anyway, there's certainly not enough evidence that indicates that any of these have adverse health effects. And then just again, hitting on a couple of the more familiar ones. So the aspartame, so this contains a few different amino acids, so phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and menthol. Again, about 180 to 200 times sweeter than actual sugar or sucrose. There is the 4 kilocalories per gram, but again, it's very small amount that's actually needed. It is not heat stable, so heating it up does denature it. Complaints of sensitivity to headaches, dizziness, and seizures. So again, based on some of those complaints or some of those side effects, the acceptable index for this is about 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So it's about 15 cans of soda, of diet soda per day. So that's a pretty significant amount. Sucralose or Splenda, even more sweeter. So about 600 times sweeter than sucrose. So again, not very much is needed to get that sweet. So it substitute chlorines for the hydroxyl groups in sucrose, so our body doesn't recognize it, can't break the bonds. It is heat stable, so as far as using it for baking, it's a good substitute. And again, only a small amount is digested because of those extra chlorines that our body just doesn't recognize. So instead, it gets excreted in our feces. And then just finishing up this one here with some other sweeteners. They were on that table. These are ones that you probably not heard as much about, maybe the stevia or Truvia. Again, about 200 to 400 times sweeter, but it provides no energy, and it's, again, generally recognized as safe. The Neotame, that has the sweetest by far, so 7 to 13,000 times sweeter. Again, it is also heat stable. So again, very small amounts would be needed to get that sweet. The other two, though, about the same, again, about 200 times sweeter. So the Luohango and then the Asulfame K, or the Sunnet. Again, these are non-digestible. Some of them, though, are heat soluble. So again, that allows them to be used for baking.